Hello and welcome back to my series on building a Squaredrop trailer. In the last video, we were able to get the tongue of the trailer finished and get the fenders mounted to the frame. And in this video, I plan on creating a custom battery box and installing a water tank. The finished camper will have a mini kitchen in the back of it, and this will require a fresh water tank. I was able to find one online that holds 6 gallons of water and is only 4 1/4 inches thick, allowing it to be tucked into the frame and giving it a lot of ground clearance. I started the install by setting the water tank in place to get a rough idea of where it'll be and how I want to mount it. I decided the best way to start is to cut a 1 by 2 inch piece of square tubing and put it on the back side of the water tank, and then another one on the front side of the water tank. The front side of the water tank could be quickly tacked into place. This front bar gives me a starting point, and then I can use the water tank to determine where the rear bar goes. This rear mounting bar is a little more complicated. It needs a cutout for the water tank supply lines. I was able to cut out a piece of the bar, and then I welded in a 3-inch piece of exhaust tubing. After cutting out the extra exhaust pipe, I was able to use magnets to hold it in place, and then I double checked to make sure everything still fit before I welded it in. The next piece is just a straight cut of 1 by 2. This piece will have 2 purposes. Number 1, it'll reinforce the floor, and number 2, it'll provide a mounting location for a future skid plate that will help protect the water tank. And now the challenge of mounting the water tank. I plan on using a stretcher style mounting system where arms will come down and hold onto the 2 side rails. The side rails are made of a 1 1/2 inch angle iron, and one of the side rails will need to be notched from the water supply line. After notching the side rail, I was able to assemble it on the bench using 3/4 inch angle on the ends and then mock fitting it with the water tank. And now this mounting system needs arms that hang down from the trailer frame and hold onto the stretcher. And this was done by cutting some short sections of angle iron and then welding them onto the frame. I used a couple clamps to help hold the stretcher onto the arms, and this allowed me to locate the holes that need to be drilled for the mounting bolts. I plan on using 4 gradiated bolts to mount the stretcher onto the arms. I chose the stretcher style mounting system because if I ever have to do any maintenance on it in the future, I'll be able to drop the water tank from underneath the trailer without removing any of the floor. The mounting holes have to be drilled both in the stretcher and in the arms, and that's what I'm doing here. I'm putting the holes through the arms. And then I'll end up putting the water tank back in place and using the clamps to help hold it while I secure it with the 4 gradiated bolts. And now the only thing left to do is the finish welds on each one of the arms. And now that the mount for the water tank is done, I would like to start working on the battery bank, but I ordered the batteries online and I still haven't received them yet. So I decided to work on the belly of the trailer, and here I'm cutting and installing just some 2 by 2s and some 1 by 2s for the floor of the trailer. These ribs will not only provide a mounting location for the floorboard, but they'll also provide extra strength for the trailer frame itself. The passenger side is pretty simple. They're just straight cuts of metal and then welded into place. But the driver's side is a little more complicated. In my original drawing, I had the propane tank for the stove mounted to the side of the trailer, and I changed my mind. I decided to put a larger 20-pound tank in the front. The larger propane tank allows for expansion in the future, maybe something like a campfire or even a hot shower. But this involves a little more work. After drilling holes on the ribs on the driver's side, I was able to take the cut piece of 1-inch tubing and put them into the holes in the ribs. And after I weld these in, it should seal out any water from getting inside the frame, and it will also allow a passageway for the propane line to run through. Well, the ribs are now done, and I'm still waiting for the batteries to arrive. In the meantime, I decided to mount the 2 trailer jacks that you saw in the unboxing part of the last video. And they're installed the same way I did the tongue of the trailer. I held them in place with a magnet and then used a wooden dowel to make sure they were plumb, tacked them in, and then after the tacks were in, I ran a full bead of weld all the way around them. And this is the first time the trailer has stood on all 3 of its legs. Later on, a couple friends stopped over, and they came up with the genius idea on how to flip over the trailer. We put a section of round tube in the receiver on the front and rear of the trailer, set it on a tall jack, and then simply rotate it over like a rotisserie. It's true what they say, 2.5 heads are better than one. And while they were here, we finished welding on the bottom of the trailer. And later in the week, the batteries finally arrived. Now I can get started on the custom battery bank. And just like with the propane tank, I wanted the battery supply to be expandable to meet any future needs. To start with, I ended up buying 2 30 amp hour batteries. However, the battery bank that I'm building will be able to contain 6 of these. In other words, I'm starting out with a 60 amp hour battery with the possibility in the future of having a 180 amp hour battery with the addition of 4 more of these batteries. That's what I'm doing here. I'm just building some wooden blanks, some wooden plugs to fill in the space where the future batteries will go. And the nice thing about lithium batteries is you don't have to have them vertical. You can lay them down on their side. This will allow for a very shallow battery box, allowing more ground clearance underneath the trailer. I plan on using a stretcher style mounting system just like I did with the water tank. The only thing different here is I have to build a box that goes around the batteries. I'm taking some measurements to determine what size box I need to build. I started by cutting the 2 main bars on the stretcher, and then I'm going to use these to help build the box upon. The main rails of the stretcher are made out of 1.5 inch angle, and then the vertical framing coming up to form the box are made out of 3/4 inch angle iron. These vertical pieces have a little notch cut out, that way the walls of the box will sit nice and flush. The other night when I had friends over to help weld the bottom of the trailer, they noticed that my old welding helmet was flashing them in the eyes and causing headaches. They recommended I get a new helmet, and boy were they right. This helmet is way better than my old one. And then I repeated the same process on the other rail of the stretcher, and then connected it with some more 3/4 inch angle, and the only thing left to do now is weld it together. And now that the frame of the battery box is done, I can start working on the walls of the battery box. The walls are going to be made out of the same material that the trailer siding will be made out of, and that's a aluminum composite material. It's 2 sheets of aluminum, real thin, with a sheet of plastic in between there. The whole thickness is about 3 millimeters, and it's cut with the same tools that you would cut plywood with. It comes in different colors. I chose a gloss white on one side and a satin white on the other. I repeated the process of cutting all these pieces for the walls of the battery box, and then I assembled it in place to make sure everything fit. However, before I permanently assemble it, I want to make sure that the frame is painted and rust-proof. While the paint is drying, I decided to get started on the lid. I found some 1 inch PVC angle at Menards, and I used this for the edge of the lid. I cut and peeled off the protective film over the ACM panel, and then I masked off on the trim pieces where I didn't want the spray adhesive. After spraying it down with this glue, I peeled off the rest of the protective film and the tape I just put on, and then stuck everything together. You can see the finished lid leaning up against the wall here. And now that the paint is dry, I can actually get to assembling the battery box itself. I'm also using this as a learning experience to see how the siding of the trailer will be mounted when it's finally done. The process involved uses a double-sided tape called VHB tape made by 3M. And after building this battery box, I'll get to see how strong it actually is. Here I'm cutting some foam strips to put in between the batteries to help with vibration. And after putting the lid on, I can take some measurements so I can get this thing mounted to the frame. I'm going to be using that same stretcher style mounting system that I used for the water tank, and this means cutting the rib in front of the battery first. I didn't show it on the water tank, but this front rib actually has a notch cut out that gets welded onto the same platform that the timbered suspension is mounted to. And then I also have to cut a hole for the future propane line. And before I weld in the 1 inch pipe in this hole, I'm going to clamp it to a strong piece of metal to try to prevent any warping from the heat of welding. These ribs that are notched that go right in front of the battery and the water tank actually give the timbered suspension a lot more strength. After being welded in solid, They reinforce that flat bracket that the suspension is mounted to. And now that this rib is cut, I can work on the rib that goes behind the battery. And the rib that goes behind the battery also has a hole cut out for a future propane line. Once those are welded in, I can work on the bar that helps reinforce the floor and provides a mounting location for a future skid plate. And now we can finally clamp the battery bank exactly where we want, and we can work on the arms that hang down from the frame and help hold the structure in place. Once I get the arms into the position exactly where I want them, I'm able to drag the welder over and then weld them down. And after drilling holes in the arms, we're finally able to get the battery bank mounted to the frame using 4 grade 8 bolts. The battery and the water tank only hang down from the frame about 2 1/4 inches. This is about the exact same distance as the rear receiver. And here's the first look of the installed water tank and battery bank. Now that most of the welding of the frame itself is done, we can start working on other important things, like running wires on the inside for the trailer lights and painting the frame. So stay tuned for the next video where exciting things happen, like a guy goes shopping and a guy unboxes things.